Hi, let's go back to Fort Mose, a place originally known as Garcia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose. It was a Spanish outpost. What's interesting about it is that it was all Africans, the first free African settlement on this continent. Because in 1693, King Charles II of Spain issued an edict, and in it it said, if you, a enslaved African, came to Florida, you would be forever granted freedom. Well, this was a mighty huge draw because England was to the north of Florida at that time in the Carolinas and Georgia. And if they could simply make it by hook, crook, or boat, and they did, they came walking, they came running, and they came by boat. As a matter of fact, the first family to arrive, the first group, came by canoe. And when they arrived, they found this hospitality was extended to them, that they'd be able to stay. So it was something very, very new. But what came of it is surprising because of this Fort Mose being in North Florida, just north of a couple of miles from St. Augustine, that if they were to get there, if they were to arrive at that location, then they would be free. Now, this was a draw that created the first Underground Railroad. This Underground Railroad ran about a century before the one we're familiar with Harriet Tubman. A century before it was happening, where the slaves were leaving the Carolinas and Georgia and they were going to Florida as best they could. And when they did this, the strange thing is that the first Underground Railroad went south, not north. And those conductors along the railroad were the Indian tribes, the natives that lived in the area. And some were friendly, not all, but they were very helpful to those that they could. And they would get them to freedom as best they could. And this worked quite well. So after this edict declaring freedom for runaway slaves if they leave English territory and come to Spain, recognize that this is the first Declaration of Independence in the history of this continent. And that was some 160 years before Abraham Lincoln. Now, in order to be accepted into the colony of Fort Mose by the Spanish, controlled by the Spanish, you had to first of all pledge allegiance to Spain, to the crown, convert to Catholicism, and serve 4 years in their armed forces. This again is the first case of a group of African Americans on our continent that were in the military. So this is the first intersection of military and black people in what we now call the United States. Their leader was a man named Francisco Menendez. In 1726, he took charge. It was in 1738 that the formal creation of Fort Mose started, and they built a fort with walls and moats, and they had huts, about 22 huts. They had a chapel, a priest. They had a whole community life. They had farming outside, and they were self-sustaining. There was fishermen, there were blacksmiths, there were leather workers, there were people that constructed boats and huts. And out of the 22 huts, one was large, and it housed nothing but single men. And some of the men that did stay in there did have wives that were living inside the walls of St. Augustine. But nevertheless, it was set there just for that purpose. Now, Menendez proved to be a very capable leader, very capable, and he became the captain of the slave militia, of the slave militant. And he did so throughout the history of Fort Mose. In 1739, 1 year after Fort Mose was set up, Africans from South Carolina took to the roads. They took guns, they took their tools, they took weapons of any kind, rocks, sticks, whatever they could find. And they marched down the road shouting liberty. This is very odd for a slave revolt. You normally try to hide and you want to attack, but they were attacked. and the state militia, everybody came after them. It took 2 days to eradicate that Stono rebellion, but they did. And this made England very nervous because it was a very bold attempt for freedom. Spain went to war with France, went to war with Britain and Britain's Indian allies. They happened to win that war, and since they did, they were able to continue with Fort Mose for a while longer. Fort Mose always had a constant population of about 100 people, men, women, and children. What ended Fort Mose was the Peace of Paris. The Peace of Paris was a declaration, it was an agreement between England and Spain that Spain gave up Northeast Florida. And that meant that the Africans, if they stayed, they were going to be re enslaved. And instead, they took to the boats and the ships, and they were given land in Cuba. So when they immigrated to Cuba, there they stayed, but the land was very poor, wasn't productive. Life was very hard. It was harder than it was in Fort Mose. So many of the Africans that came from that original first Black American settlement moved into the cities of Ponce and Santa Domingo and different areas around the Caribbean. And that, in effect, ended Fort Mose. But now we know a few critical things, and that is that we had Blacks that arrived far sooner than our common history tells us, and that they were in the military, and that they were free, and that they were productive. This is the story of Fort Mose. Thank you.